Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Wandering Cantos. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the poetic genius of Moona Hoshinova's High Tide. So, a bit about the song. High Tide was released on February 16th, 2022. The lyrics were written by Z. Sunder. However, the concept comes from Moona Hoshinova, so therefore it's important to remember that in this discussion we're considering it as a Moona Hoshinova project, sort of in a larger sense. So that's why we're calling it the poetic genius of Moona Hoshinova. And the idea for this one actually came from a listener suggestion. So, always feel free to leave your suggestions and recommendations in the comments. I genuinely check them out, and it's sort of, helpful to kind of hear what you guys would like to see. And, while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe. It helps grow the community, helps grow the discussion, and makes these videos all the better. So, some things to keep in mind. As always, I like to give just a general disclaimer. Basically, just reminding everyone that these are my personal interpretations and observations, so I'm by no means intending to project my ideas onto the artist. We sort of come at this from a literary criticism perspective, so we sort of celebrate the idea of the death of the author, which basically just means that once a piece of writing is published, it's no longer the sole property of the writer, especially in regards to interpretation. And since we all come to different pieces of media with totally different backgrounds and different exposure to different pieces of media, we're all going to draw different comparisons and therefore find different meanings. So it's always helpful to consider the author's intent, but there's some flexibility with this. So a little thing I like to do with these is give some further reading. So basically, if you enjoy this song and if you enjoy this discussion, here are some romantic poems which you might also enjoy. So we'll go No More a Roving by Lord Byron, which is all about sort of romantic escapes under the moonlit sky. There is Strange Fits of Passion Have I Known by William Wordsworth, which has very interesting image with the moon that I don't want to spoil here. And then Boat Stealing, which is sort of an excerpt section from the prelude. Honestly, I recommend reading the entire prelude, but there's a specific passage that has some very interesting sort of imagery around a moon and sort of a personification of the moon. So I think those would all be very interesting to you if you like this song. So with that being said, I think we can jump right into the close reading. To keep things more organized, we're going to sort of follow a structure, which is basically reading the passage, looking for rhyme scheme, and then going line by line to identify metaphor, simile, imagery, tone, etc. I had a question ask why we do this structure and why we specifically look at rhyme scheme. Thing is when you're analyzing poetry, it can be helpful to look at rhyme scheme because that can sometimes tell you what type of poem it is, and if you know what type of poem it is, you might have a better sense of the meaning. For example, sonnets, especially Shakespearean sonnets that are written in the Shakespearean rhyme scheme, tend to be about love. So with that being said, I think we can jump right into it. So the song begins with an opening verse that goes, "When you look up at the night sky, what do you see? The glowing beauty in the twilight, it's no mystery. Now watch me set the scene, I'll light it all up. When the time has come, I'll be rising high, longing for me like a lifeline whenever you see." So we've got a couple rhymes here. So we have, let's see, so we got sky and high. Then we got, let's do green, we got sea, mystery, and sea. So we'll call those our B rhymes. And then we have sort of an almost rhyme here, twilight and night, but since it's not the end word, it's not a rhyme in the way we would, identify here, but it is a rhyme. And then we have the words up and lifeline, which don't really rhyme. So we would call these our C's, which would give us a sort of A, B, C, B, C, A, C, B rhyme scheme. But jumping into the actual lines here, we have, when you look up at the night sky. So we already have the use of you, which tells us that there's sort of already a relationship between the narrator / speaker of the poem and someone else, because this doesn't seem to be spoken in second person as in it being ambiguous. It seems to be talking to someone specific, because then they're asking, what do you see? The glowing beauty in the twilight, it's no mystery. Now watch me set the scene, I'll light it all up. Now what I really liked about this opening part, and one of the first parts that made me realize that this song had a true degree of poetry to it, is that they're saying to look up in the night sky and tell them what you see. But what you see is the glowing beauty in the twilight. So if the twilight is sort of the light source, there's actually a glowing beauty within it, and the beauty is glowing. So now, follow me here, because this is going to seem, weirdly pedantic or something. But so you have your light source, right? And then you have the fact that light source is shining onto something else. So there's this beautiful thing, but it gains its beauty by being illuminated in the light. So, if you were to have a vacuum where, you had a room of pure darkness where there was genuinely no light source, it was 100% void of light, and then you placed a beautiful item that didn't emit any light, in that room, it's still it could be argued that item wouldn't actually have any beauty because you couldn't see it. If the beauty can't be observed, is it even beauty? Sort of if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? If a beautiful object is never actually seen, is it beautiful? How do we know that it's beautiful? How would you be able to identify it? So it's sort of an interesting paradox. So here there's this interesting point that's being brought up, that the beauty comes from the glowing light in the twilight. So it's the fact that it's in the twilight that it gains this beauty. So therefore, this speaker is arguing that the light of the moon is what gives night landscapes their beauty. Without that moonlight, without that twilight, you're just not going to have that beauty. So then they say, now watch me set the scene. I'll light it all up. So here they're taking credit for that moonlight. So they're saying, once again, there's these beautiful things that you should, you can look up in the night sky. You'll see this beauty, but you're only seeing it from the light. And where's that light coming from? It's coming from me. And then it says, when the time has come, I'll be rising high, longing for me like a lifeline whenever you see. And so the whenever you see part we'll address in the next section, since that's sort of leading us into the next part of the poem. But there's also this interesting other image going on here, which is, the song is called High Tide. Well, what is a high tide? A high tide is basically a phenomenon in which the gravity of the moon, the gravitational pull of the moon, actually causes the waters to rise up basically towards the moon, which then gives us a high tide. And so here they're using that image of this water being sort of drawn towards the moon as sort of a metaphor or an analogy for this sort of relationship between these two people. So just as the moon will rise up, and the higher the moon gets, it rises up. And of course, what's also interesting is that, like with science, since the moon doesn't actually rise up, it's orbiting. But the point being is that, like, within this analogy, you can imagine it as the moon is below. It goes up, it rises up, gets higher, and as it does so, it's going to cause this other person to long for it like a lifeline. And so I just think that's a really interesting image. Like, let's just take a moment and appreciate that this person is effectively drawing a comparison where they're saying, I am like the moon, and you will long for me just as the waters and the sea long for that moon. My gravitational pull will literally rise you up. And it's also sort of beautiful because, like, that sort of image that I just described is, it's sort of like, it's a confident expression. It's one saying, like, I'm going to make you long for me. So there's sort of like a, a power dynamic, a sort of like one person is being assertive that they're like, you're going to yearn for me. But on the other hand, I think we should just sort of appreciate that, to think of the waters on Earth, to think of the oceans, to think of them as rising up out of a sense of longing and yearning, especially like a lifeline. Like a lifeline tells us, it's a simile because it's using either like or as. So basically, if you're using this comparisons, it has like or as in it, it's a simile. This simile is telling us that it's not a half-hearted longing. It's not a sort of like, oh, you'll kind of miss me, you'll kind of yearn for me. It's a level of longing and yearning, like you are, yearning for something that would, keep you alive. It's no different than, someone who's dying of thirst will long for, a glass of water, something to sustain them. There's a level of desperation when you're reaching for a lifeline. If you were like drowning and you were reaching for, an inflatable tube, that's your lifeline. You're not going to be half-heartedly reaching for that. There's going to be such a passion to that. And so, next time you are out in nature and you happen to see, high tide, say you're walking along the beach, it's interesting to look at that and think of those waters as yearning for the moon, and also sort of, by proxy, yearning for the night sky, yearning to rise up and touch the stars. I just think that's actually very beautiful. So that being said, let's move on to the next part. Here we just have a short little pre-chorus which connects to that first verse. So the first verse ends with, whenever you see, then the pre-chorus goes, my shine, I'll catch your eye. And, there's not a ton to nitpick here, except that once again, we have this sort of relationship through these sort of like pronouns, etc., where we have my and I and your. So we have this sense of, this dynamic and relationship between these two. I mean, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words, and 3 of them are, literally half of them are directly just words about this relationship, my, I, and your. But then it's also interesting because it says, whenever you see my shine, I'll catch your eye. And catching your eye here, it's basically saying that you will, whenever you see my eye or my shine, it will fully capture your attention. It'll catch your eye. It won't be that you're looking through the peripheral. You think you see some of the shine and then you kind of never look. It'll fully catch your attention. Which again, it's sort of an interesting, there's sort of a, again, sort of like a power dynamic here a little bit, where the I character here is certainly, they're confident in their ability to be sort of enthralling. But let's get into the next part. This brings us to our chorus, which goes, it's pulling you in like gravity. You will be bowing on your knees, yeah, pulling you in close to me. Watch my glory and might following me like a high tide. My reign will never stop. The tide begins to rise up to the top. Let my power ignite, following me like a high tide. And here we have more rhyme. So we have gravity and me. Those are close enough, I would say. Some could argue that the T sort of ruins it, but the ye and the me definitely have a rhyme to it. We have yeah doesn't rhyme with anything, and knees, it doesn't look like it rhymes with anything, but then we have, so let's call that our B, and then we have C for tide, which goes along with tide again, and ignite is sort of close to tide, at least visually, but it's not close enough. And then we have stop and top. So then I would classify ignite as an E, which gives us an A, B, A, C, D, D, E, C rhyme scheme. But now let's get into the line by line. I'm pulling you in like gravity. This part's sort of interesting because of its word choice. So now comes the part I say in every episode, but poetry, songwriting, you have such a limited amount of words that you can use. So every word choice matters. If you're writing a massive novel that's thousands and thousands of pages, technically there's less pressure on every word to be the perfect word. But when you get, only a handful of words, you're going to have to make sure that those word choices are, correct or at least intentional. And so therefore, when you're interpreting them, it's sort of fair game to get, really into the weeds with your sort of, dissection of the piece. So it's pulling you in like gravity. It's is interesting because it's not saying I'm pulling you in like gravity. It's, which so far I would sort of describe as being this sort of light or being beauty itself. So that light and beauty certainly relate to the I'm, but it is sort of interesting that they're sort of being shown as being different. There's sort of this dynamic again of there's an object that is being shined upon, and the light that's shining upon it is actually what, causes that sense of beauty. It's not actually the object, but it is the moonlight that is shining onto the object that gives you that overall sense of beauty. But what's interesting here is, well, where's that moonlight coming from? It's coming from the moon. Well, ironically, it's actually coming from sunlight, and sunlight is then reflecting off of the moon. But for the purposes of this piece, I think we should just think of it as moonlight. But that moonlight causes the light, but it is the light that causes the beauty. So here there's that difference of the it's versus the I'm. But then also I'm pulling you in like gravity, or it's pulling you in like gravity. I feel like the use of pulling you in, it tends to, it's sort of like it's a different type of phrase than just being like, oh, this thing makes you go close to something, if you will. You tend to pull someone into a hug, or a story could pull in its reader. But there's sort of like an intimacy to that where, if a story's really good, the reader is going to feel emotionally connected to that story, and therefore they're going to get pulled into the story. There's an emotional element, if you fall while riding your bike, you wouldn't say that the street pulled you in. You don't say the street pulled you into it. Or if you fall downstairs, you wouldn't say that, the bottom stair pulled you in. That just isn't a phrase you would use. But you would use it as, there's a child was crying, and so their mother pulled them into a warm hug. A lover pulled you into their embrace. or a book pulled you in, a movie pulled you in, things that you kind of care about. There's an emotional level to that phrase. So here, I think that, that reflects the fact that there seems to be a relationship between the sort of I and the you. And then, as we were already sort of identifying in that first verse and that pre-chorus, there's sort of this power dynamic. You will be bowing on your knees. That's clearly, sort of power dynamic, sort of, bending the knee to the king. It's a sort of, a dominating person and a submissive person. It's not a equal meeting. It's not two people meeting on the same plane and equal. Instead, one is bending to show their devotion to the other who stands above them. What's interesting about that, though, is this amazing little doodle I just drew was not for nothing. If you look at it, do you notice that the person who is standing is higher up, and it's almost like a moon, and then the surface of the earth / the water? Do you see what I'm saying? If someone bends their knee and they get lower and they're on the knee, and then someone else is standing because they don't bend the knee, this is the same angle as the moon would shine upon the waters. So if we're the water, as in the you, and this other person is the moon, that image of bending the knee actually works. And then, usually, when you bend your knee to like a king or a queen, for example, afterwards, the king and queen, king or queen would then basically say, you may rise. And what is a high tide? A high tide is when the waters rise. So this bowing image actually perfectly works with this sort of dynamic of the sea and high tides, in which they lower, and then suddenly when the moon, is at the right position and the gravitational pull is correct, they rise up. So I just think that's pretty interesting. Pulling you in, again, we get the pulling you in. So that's now been repeated. And if something's repeated, it usually means it's important. Close to me. So that further cements what we were talking about with the use of pulling you in rather than just being pulled in. You're pulling me in close to me, so it's like an embrace, it's like a hug, that kind of thing. Watch my glory and might following me like a high tide. Now that's sort of interesting because you can read that two different ways. It could be saying that glory and might are the waters that rise up towards this moon figure, so they follow the moon like a high tide, which is kind of a cool expression to be like, wherever I go, my glory and might follow me. But you could also read that as them saying, follow me like a high tide and you will be able to watch my glory and might. So who's doing the following? Is the glory and might doing the following, or is the you doing the following? My reign will never stop. And here we get, again, image of sort of a king or queen. So a sort of, dominating force. The tide begins to rise up to the top. Let my power ignite, following me like a high tide. Ignite is a sort of interesting word choice. Wouldn't you agree? I feel like I don't normally think, I think of ignite as being like flames. Now that being said, where does moon's light come from? The moon's light is a reflection of sunlight, and the sun is basically a giant sphere of flame, kind of. It's more complicated than that, but, this is a poetry class, not an astrology class. So, it actually is very fair to say that you could, the moon's light actually can be described with this sort of term of something of a power being ignited, because it actually is basically flame being reflected by the moon. So, very interesting word choice. Again, it's unexpected, and that is poetry. I feel like one of the big pillars of poetry is to use familiar words, familiar images and expressions, but then twist them in a way that's unexpected, because that is what causes your reader to sort of pause on a passage and sort of, they almost see it more vividly since it surprised them, and they're going to think about it more. So yeah, just a lot of really, really cool wordplay going on here. Like, this is some of the best poetry I think we've looked at thus far. So we then get our second verse, which goes, "I can be a bright enigma. It's no surprise. It's no surprise, yeah. But you'll give in to the brilliance like a moth to a light. Playing hard to get, but I ain't patient. You'll succumb to my blinding radiance, yeah. When you look up at the night sky, what do you see?" And here, unlike some of our other passages, we don't really have a lot of rhyme. Yeah and yeah rhyme, but you get enigma, brilliance, light, patient, radiance, which is close to brilliance with that ence sound at the end. I guess you could maybe call that a rhyme. Then you get night sky and sea. But to go line by line, let's get into the thick of it. So, right from the get-go, an extremely cool image, and again, sort of a turn of phrase, a cool pairing of words, which that is poetry. So, what is an enigma? It is a mystery. It is something that is sort of a puzzle, a sort of, an unknown, a sort of like impenetrable mystery. It's like, again, it's like a code. It's much harder to get to the truth of it. And then you get bright, which, you normally associate mystery with a sort of hiddenness. And usually with hidden, there's sort of a darkness, a sort of shadow, a sort of, almost underground sense to it. But then bright is, shining a light on it. This is supposed to be a light bulb, by the way. And so here, you don't normally... normally, if anything, people use the expression where they say, I'm going to bring this mystery into the light. I'm going to bring your crimes and stuff into the light so people know what it's all about. But here, the mystery and the enigma itself is bright, which is just really interesting. It's something an image I've never really come across before. And then it says, it's no surprise, which is sort of a sentiment that's been repeated throughout this, that there's sort of this sense of it's no surprise, and it's sort of, you should expect this. I feel like this one, it feels like the dynamic between the I and the you is already well established. It feels like the you in this example, which could be, us as the reader, or, could be a more specific person, they already know that they should be bending the knee, and, they should be sort of, enthralled by this, moon and moonlight. So this isn't their first, exposure to it, let's say. It's interesting, it says, but you'll give in to the brilliance. This one's very interesting because the but implies that there's a resistance. Also, the use of give in. It's not that, and you'll swim within the brilliance, and you'll rest within the light. But despite the fact that it's no surprise, and despite the fact that I can be a bright enigma, you will give in to the brilliance like a moth to a light. Now, this is all the more interesting because usually the expression is moth to a flame. And we just talked about the use of ignite. I mean, you can ignite a light for sure, but I do think it's sort of interesting that this moonlight is technically flame-based in a way. unless I have a total misunderstanding of how the sun works. But again, I am but a mere poet, so don't judge me for that. But here they use light instead of flame because they're really emphasizing here brilliance, light, bright enigma. I think the reason they're saying that is because they're trying to emphasize the light aspect of moonlight rather than the warmth of a flame. Because with this imagery of I'll pull you in closer to me, you know, we think of hugs, we describe them as warm if they're good. Oh, she gives such warm hugs. So there's this flame, there's this warmth aspect to flames, while moonlight doesn't usually have that. And so I think the use of light here is to sort of separate the expression from flame, because flame definitely implies a level of warmth. And I think it's interesting because, again, there seems to be sort of a almost like dominatrix-y sort of dominating power dynamic with this sort of relationship, which definitely fits with moonlight. Because if you think of sunlight as being like the extrovert, the warm lover, the sort of familiar, you know, oh, it gives life and everyone sort of sits out in the sun and it feels good and it's such a like a I don't know, giving relationship. Moonlight is cold and it doesn't really give you that much beyond beauty, because really all moonlight does is shine a light. It doesn't really warm you. And so in that sense, you know, if you're like in the woods at night and there's moonlight, really the only thing the moon's doing for you is letting you see the beauty of the trees, etc. So I think that's why we're getting the word light instead of flame. Similarly with brilliance, that's sort of like the aspect of a bright, very bright light you describe as sort of being brilliant. We can also sort of describe brilliance as being a sort of level of beauty. So yeah, I think that all is connected. And then playing hard to get, but I ain't patient. Now this is interesting because we're now getting a reveal through their sort of description here that we know that the you in this, who could again be a specific person, could be the audience, could be the fans, who knows, this you is actually sort of resisting, which goes along with the but you'll give in. The speaker is confident, once again, we get that word confident, but they're confident that this other person will give in, but right now they're playing hard to get. And this is almost a bit of a warning. There's sort of a, hey, you're playing hard to get, but know that I'm not patient. So like, don't do that much longer kind of thing. You'll succumb to my blinding radiance. So again, succumb is very much like a giving in kind of thing. Again, it's that sort of, you succumb to something. It's like if you're hungry at first, you experience the hunger and it's uncomfortable, but it goes on and on and on, and you continue to be hungry and continue to like have that sort of like discomfort of hunger going at you over and over again until you eventually succumb to it. Succumb sort of has to do with like a breaking point, which is interesting because in the previous passages, I was not picking up on this sort of, the moon here is sort of trying to break the will of the you so that then they'll, I guess, adore the moon in that way. When you look up at the night sky, what do you see? And this is sort of a callback to that first verse. And then we have another pre-chorus. So, you know, this part here above is from the previous verse. So all together it goes, when you look up at the night sky, what do you see? My shine and effulgent sight. So here we have, interestingly, only now my, and this entire thing is sort of just all within the my, the me, the I realm. There isn't that you within this pre-chorus, while before we saw that, you know, it was a 50-50 sort of situation. my shine and effulgent sight. This is, this effulgent is sort of a bright, sort of a radiant, and it is usually used kind of in the context of sort of describing someone's face. So, sort of like how you would say, oh, they beamed with joy. It's kind of that sort of sense. So again, here, what's sort of interesting is that it's my shine. Here, previously we kind of had more of a moon image where it was truly a moon. Now it seems to be almost in a bit more clear that this moon, the surface of this moon really might just be sort of a metaphor for our sort of narrator speaker's face, because it's sort of the shine of her face, the beauty of her face. Her face emits this sort of glow that sort of, it's the presence of that makes everything else beautiful. Said differently, this is true interpretation. This could be a total misinterpretation, but I feel like said differently, it could almost be like, which is sort of a really cool kind of flex, as if you were to basically say, oh, you're walking through a forest. The forest isn't beautiful, but if you're walking in the forest with me, and you see me within the forest, and it's my observation of the forest and the beauty of my face, the beauty of my face is going to make the forest beautiful by sort of association. Is that definitely what's being said here? I don't know, but there's an argument for it. And then we get our bridge, which goes, I shine the brightest in the night, the way the waves come nigh. Oh yeah. And here, there's not really a rhyme, which is all the more interesting since it's only one difference, in letter. That T makes all the difference, but also interesting that they mean totally different things. Night is night, and nigh means sort of close or, near. You come close, you come nigh, sort of an approaching sort of word. So, I shine the brightest in the night, the way the waves come nigh. What's also interesting here is sort of the bridge is usually where you sort of get a shift in a song, maybe a shift in theme, maybe a reveal. It's sort of like in a sonnet, how like around the 8th line you sort of get, a change. Here, there's sort of two main observations. One, they're saying, I shine the brightest in the night, the way the waves come nigh. It almost is implied that the waves coming nigh either is part of what makes them shine the brightest. It's sort of like, oh, I look the best when I'm on stage, the way the stage lights shine on me. You see how that sort of the way kind of almost implies that it's the waves come nigh is what actually makes them shine the brightest. It's the way that the waves come nigh that make them shine the brightest. That being said, it also could mean that they know they shine the brightest in the night because of the way the waves come nigh. So it's sort of the waves coming nigh that lets them know that they're actually shining the brightest, because during the daytime, there isn't a high tide in the same way because, in the sense of the lore of this, the moon isn't present, so the moon can't draw the waves near with its gravitational pull and its light and all of that stuff. The second big observation I want to bring up is the U that we saw much more earlier in the song has disappeared as of the last couple parts. Now, that being said, there has been a chorus in between these, but it's the same chorus that we looked at before, so I'm not dissecting it. But so U is present there, but in terms of all the new content, I feel like the U has been disappearing more and more as we go through this. So let's take a look at the last main real section and see sort of where we kind of end up. So then we get our post-chorus. So again, I've skipped a chorus, but it's the same as what we've seen before. So we get this post-chorus, which goes, follow me, follow me, follow me, whoa, whoa. Follow me, follow me, follow me, following me like a high tide. Follow me, follow me, follow me, whoa, whoa, yeah. And so with this part, there's sort of an interesting observation to start off with is that once again, this you has sort of disappeared. So that the you is now sort of this unmentioned high tide, almost that the you perhaps has bent the knee and then just become the high tide, because one has to say, well, what does bending the knee really mean? What does sort of this being fully enthralled by the moon in the sense fully mean? Does it mean sort of a relinquishing one's own identity to just become a follower and sort of become almost like a worshiper, and you sort of like you lose your sense of identity in that because you're worshiping another in that sense. Again, I can't fully make that argument, because if we look at the whole piece altogether, the fact that the choruses do show up in between these passages, those still have the you being mentioned. But I still think it's interesting that all the new text sort of totally drops that sort of two-part dynamic, and it becomes much more just this sort of commandingness, which is then leads me to the second sort of observation, which is that this very much has sort of a chant / command vibe to it. There's a repetition, follow me, 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 and even following me like a high tide. So you have this sort of command, an observation that command is being satisfied, and then the command. What I mean by that is if it were to say, run to the store, run to the store, run to the store, and then here it was saying like you're running to the store, run to the store. It's saying by including that in the middle of it, we get that they are actively already following them like a high tide, but they're still insisting on commanding that sort of dynamic continues. There's sort of an unbrokenness to it where it's like you're doing it right now, but you better keep doing it, presumably forever. So yeah, that more or less sort of like wraps up this larger episode of the Poetic Genius stuff. To take a look back at this song, so some of the other pieces we've looked at, there's a very clear narrative, which would be like a narrative poem, which you can get in epic poems or even shorter poems that tell a story where you truly get like a beginning, middle, and end, and there's a true shift in the sort of protagonist or the speaker. I'm using protagonist sort of loosely because you don't really think of protagonists as being in poems, but there kind of is a protagonist, I would argue anyway, which is sort of the speaker. But so you get it where they might start off heartbroken, but by the end they learn to move on, or I'm nervous about confessing to this other person, but by the end they've confessed and now they're happy because they're in the relationship. Here, there's not that as much, but it doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to be a narrative poem in that way. Most poetry doesn't have that. Here, there seems to be more just sort of like a larger thesis statement about sort of the dynamic between the I and the you. Sort of a doubling down of a desire for the you to bend the knee, to, succumb to sort of basically the beauty and the sort of enthrallment of the beauty of the sort of moon or moon-like person. And it sort of ends in that way. I do think there is still a bit of a narrative in that, like I said, the you sorts to start to disappear more and more, and then it ends with the follow me, which feels like the reveal that person who is playing the role of you has indeed succumbed by the end, and now they're in this sort of endless state of following the beauty of this moon-like figure. So you do get that. But also, like I said, since it's sort of a thesis statement in that way, there's not much of a change in the perspective of the moon-like person. Although we did see a bit in the sort of insecurity of saying, like, I know you'll succumb to my brilliance, but it's almost like a methinks she doth protest too much, where it's like the more you say, like, oh, you'll give in, it almost is like, why do you keep saying that? Are you almost worried they won't give in, if that makes sense? But Yeah, this is just mostly the real purpose I wanted to do is just because there was some really cool imagery and some really cool wordplay in this one. And that's what I really wanted to highlight and why I think it sort of belongs in this larger series of the poetic genius of. So yeah, that's going to conclude today's episode of the Poetic Genius of. So thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to then be notified when there's more of this. Right now, I'm sort of doing a lot of HoloLive videos. Eventually, I'm hoping to branch out and do, some videos on some other artists. There's a lot of interesting writers out there. And I also am working on sort of figuring out a format to sort of discuss the sort of writing that you see in movies. So I want to look at writing techniques like Freytag's pyramid and rising action and, sort of looking at how stories are told and where people make mistakes and where, they are, excel and are doing a really great job. So subscribe so you can be notified of all that. And if you liked this particular video, please consider giving it a like. Kind of helps boost it, and then it can help sort of grow the community and therefore grow the sort of discussion around these sort of songs, which leads me to my next thing, which is I would love to hear your thoughts on this song and sort of my interpretation of it. Did you agree with my interpretation? Did you disagree? And if so, why? Please let me know in the comments. Like I said in the beginning, with the whole death of the author part, it's like everyone's going to have a different interpretation of this. Everyone's going to get something different out of it. And so I'd love to hear your interpretations. I'm actually not super familiar with this VTuber. I'm still relatively new to the whole HoloLive scene. I've only been a fan for about a year, but I've mostly been checking out the EN one. So I'm excited to listen to more of her music and check out sort of that whole side of HoloLive. But as a result, I'm not super familiar with the lore. So if there was some interesting bits of lore that was apparent in the song that I sort of missed, I'd love to hear about that because they can help sort of grow our understanding of the song. But yeah, with that being said, take care, and I will see you in the next one.